To the story now, South Africa is turning a new leaf in fighting corruption. That's according to President Cyril Ramaphosa as he was addressing the nation last night. He says government is determined to uproot corruption and will use every tool to bring the corrupt to book. But the big question is if still we'll see those implicated, including the politically connected in orange overalls. Well, let's discuss this now with a political analyst, Bheki Mngomezulu. Professor, good morning and thank you very much for your time. I must say there's been mixed views on the president's address, just watching yesterday after he addressed us. As a start, he prefaced his action plan with a statement that they accept that state capture existed. Then he went on to remind the nation that as per the Constitution, the recommendations of the inquiry do not bind the president. Some say that was important just to manage people's expectations around the implementation of those recommendations. What did you make of it?
No, thank you very much for having me. Yes, the question we started off with is the most appropriate one. And in fact, legally, the president was on point in saying that the recommendations are not binding. But from a layman's point of view, then the question that arises is why did we have the commission in the first place if we're not going to implement its recommendations? So it depends on where you stand on the issue. If you are looking at it from the legal perspective, you would agree with the president that he was absolutely right. But then if you look at it from the general public, we are going to ask the question if the close to 1 billion rand that was spent on the commission was worth it, if we're not going to implement these resolutions and then take them as just recommendations and then second guess them or decide which ones to implement and which ones to leave out, which then raises the question as to whether you will be selective in the implementation process and then only choose the aspects of the recommendations that will suit you and then leave the rest. So that is why there is this ongoing debate.
And then let's delve into those aspects that he decided to tackle last night at the very least, or give us an update on. What did you make of his announcement around the investigating directorate being permanent or being made a permanent entity now? Because some, the likes of, it wouldn't be correct, Accountability Now, to be exact, were not necessarily worried about its permanence only. They were also calling for an entity independent of the NPA because there's also a conversation around the NPA and whether it should possibly consider being independent of the Justice Ministry. So what did you make of just that when he stated that for corruption, they're going to make this particular entity now permanent?
You know what, my sister, I'll be honest with you. This notion of independence, I've lost confidence in it because constitutionally, even the judiciary is supposed to be independent. But is it independent? I'm not too sure. So therefore, whether you have an independent institution or you have a permanent institution is neither here nor there, will only be able to be comforted by the fact that they are executing their mandate in an impartial manner, and then they are following the law to the letter. But even if it is permanent, if it is not doing what it's supposed to do, it will still not achieve anything. If it is a separate entity and it doesn't do what it is supposed to do, it will still amount to nothing. So I think we are having a problem that the number of people who are credible, the number of people who are reliable, the number of people who respect the Constitution, that number has gone significantly down. So there are very few people who can be trusted right now. So which then makes it difficult to have an institution that will either be independent and effective or both.
But around the permanency, there was at one point a conversation around their inability to attract the necessary skills because most people would then not be sure of beyond a one-year contract they'd be able to find employment elsewhere. So wouldn't you say that at least in that respect, he listened when they said we're unable to attract the necessary skills if this entity itself is not permanent, everybody's working on a contract basis and they need job security?
No, on that point, I totally agree. I totally agree. It's just like giving someone a 5-year contract at an advanced age, and then chances are, after the 5 years, what then? So that becomes a problem because then what happens is that in principle, you are effective for the first 3 years. At the end of the 3rd year, we are already looking for other options elsewhere. So your focus is no longer there. You use the 4th and the 5th year looking for other jobs elsewhere. So on that one, I agree that in principle, that is the right approach. But what I will get the correct candidates that's a different story altogether. But on the first part, I totally agree.
And then Prasad was another important one. He wants to allow the current investigations to wrap up before deciding if we should have another commission of inquiry. What did you make of that?
No, that will be a total waste of money, my sister. The Zondo Commission has made the recommendations, and it's clear who should be prosecuted, and it's clear where further investigation is needed. You don't need a special commission for that. There are law enforcement agencies, and there are people who are occupying those positions, and these people are getting paid. Let the NPA do its job, and then follow up on the recommendations of the Zondo Commission. And if there are any prosecutions to be done, let them be done. To come up with another commission, this commission was supposed to be there for 6 months, and we ended up taking 4 years. And how much money did we spend there? And is the result that we are getting equivalent to the money we put in there? I wouldn't recommend another commission. Rather, use the already existing state institutions to carry out their job without any favor, and then make sure that the recommendations are implemented.
Well, if you agree with him here, then perhaps your initial opening statement that what was it all for if he's going to use his discretion as to what he implements from the recommendations and what he doesn't, then meaning here you now agree with him that in this instance you would think it would be a waste of money as per the recommendation from the Chief Justice, Raymond Zondo, that there be another commission to deal specifically with PRASA.
No, on that one, we all agree. You can't have 5 commissions investigating the same thing, because it means that the first commission has failed. That is what we'll be saying, basically, although in a tacit manner. I'm saying that this issue of saying that the president will lose his discretion, I'm saying that there are 2 versions of the story, as I said at the beginning. On the legal side, the president is right that, in fact, not all the recommendations can be implemented. So on that one, I agree from a legal perspective. But then I'm saying that not everyone is a lawyer. You and I are just ordinary people out there. We'll be looking at things from a rational perspective, and then we'll be saying, if indeed it was necessary for us to have this Zondo Commission, and then it took 4 years to conclude its work with all editorials on the reports, and then now using about 1 billion rand, and then you say now you are going to second guess. That is where the general public is coming from. What I was doing basically was to balance things and say, let us not look at this issue from one side. Let us consider both sides and then have a full picture.
I suppose that's why conversations such as these are very important, to give them that full picture. Then around the executive, some had expected that the president would probably have some tough position on those mentioned in the report, but he said he's basically still seized with the matter. The DA basically saying this was merely kicking for touch. There's nothing that's possibly going to be done. There's consideration ahead of the elective conference, so the president wouldn't want to upset any particular lobby group.
You know, the president on this one, with all his mistakes, but I think on this one, he's correct in treading carefully, because you don't want to fire a minister just because there is pressure that is mounting. We have to satisfy yourself that if you fire a minister, then this is what we are doing in terms of Section 84 of the Constitution, not because of pressure groups from elsewhere, be they political opposition political parties, or be they even people from your own political party. So once he has satisfied himself, then he can do a cabinet reshuffle anytime. There is nothing preventing him from doing that. But of course, the other point that you are mentioning, the build-up to the December conference of the ANC, indeed, it will always be a factor, because you don't want to rock the boat, as it were. So you want to make sure that you tread carefully, but then you also execute your mandate as per the Constitution. So I think the president is doing the right thing, at least on that one. I agree with him.
And of course, there must be the assumption that there is never a conflation of party and state, that the considerations pertaining to the party would not find expression here where he is a head of state. But there was also the one very topical one that others expected around cadre deployment, which would have muddied waters a bit. We heard nothing of that. What did you make of that decision not to tackle that one, even though it's before the courts?
You know, my sister, let us be honest. This issue of cadre deployment is not a problem, and it has never been a problem, and it will never be a problem. The problem with cadre deployment is when you deploy people who are incapable. That is the only problem. Because you look at all political parties, you go to any country in the world, that is exactly what they do. The only difference with the ANC is that it was honest about it, and it called it what it is, cadre deployment. Otherwise, everybody does that. I've made this point before when I was saying that let's look at the first two political parties that are leading the country nationally, that is the ANC and the DA. I was asking the question, is what is happening with the Western Cape legislature different from what the ANC is doing? My answer was no, because during the election, you find many black faces canvassing for the DA. Immediately after the election, you find white faces occupying positions in government and in the Federal Council of the Western Cape. So I was saying that is cadre deployment. The only difference that the DA is not openly saying that we are doing cadre deployment, and the ANC, on the other hand, is saying that this is cadre deployment. That's the only difference. So if the ANC were to change and deploy correct people or the right people with the requisite skills, there would be no problem with cadre deployment, at least as far as I'm concerned.
I think the latter is probably what drew attention to cadre deployment, the fact that some did not have the requisite skills, that perhaps if they were always deploying those that were fit for purpose, maybe it wouldn't have become so topical or a subject of great debate in the country. But thank you very much for your time, Professor. That was political analyst Professor Bheki Mngomezulu.